Zara Okafor's slender fingers trembled as she adjusted the soft cotton fabric of her bright yellow hijab for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The mirror in her family's cramped apartment bathroom reflected back dark brown eyes that held depths of worry she tried desperately to conceal from her parents. At 17, she had already mastered the delicate art of hiding her fears behind carefully constructed masks of composure, but lately, those masks felt increasingly fragile. The yellow hijab had been a gift from her grandmother in Lebanon, sent across continents with love and prayers woven into every thread. The elderly woman had chosen the vibrant color deliberately, writing in her careful Arabic script that it represented sunshine and hope for her beloved granddaughter's new life in America. But as Zara stared at her reflection, she wondered if her grandmother could have foreseen how that same bright color would make her a target, drawing unwanted attention like a beacon in the gray landscape of Roosevelt High School. "Habibti, breakfast is ready," her mother's gentle voice called from the kitchen, using the Arabic endearment that always made Zara's heart clench with both love and longing. Amira Okafor's voice carried the musical cadence of their homeland, softened by years of speaking English, but never quite losing its distinct melody. Zara took one final look in the mirror, practicing the smile she would wear throughout the day, not too bright to seem fake, not too dim to invite questions. She had perfected this expression over the 3 months since their move from Detroit, where their Lebanese-American community had provided a buffer against the outside world's scrutiny. Here, in this small Ohio town, she felt exposed and vulnerable, like a single flower blooming in a field of concrete. The kitchen smelled of za'atar and olive oil, familiar scents that transported Zara momentarily back to weekend mornings in their old apartment, where her mother would prepare elaborate breakfast spreads, while Arabic music played softly from the radio. Now, in this sterile rental with its beige walls and fluorescent lighting, those same smells seemed out of place, foreign in the most painful way. Her father, Khalil Okafor, sat at the small dining table with his newspaper spread before him, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, as he read the morning headlines with the same intensity he brought to everything in life. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and despite working double shifts at the automotive plant, he had maintained the dignified bearing that had made him a respected imam back in Detroit. "How did you sleep, ya Nouraini?" he asked, without looking up from his paper, using the Arabic phrase meaning "light of my eyes" that he had called her since childhood. His voice carried that special warmth reserved only for his daughter, the tone that had once made her feel like the most precious thing in the universe. "Fine, Baba," Zara lied smoothly, settling into her chair across from him. In truth, she had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every humiliating encounter from the previous week and dreading what new torments awaited her in the halls of Roosevelt High. The nightmares had become a nightly visitor, featuring faceless tormentors who pulled at her hijab and shouted words that echoed the real voices she heard every day. Amira placed a plate before her daughter, loaded with warm pita bread, labna cheese drizzled with olive oil, and fresh vegetables cut into perfect crescents. The presentation was beautiful, but Zara's stomach churned with anxiety, making the thought of food almost nauseating. She picked up a piece of cucumber and nibbled at it dutifully, knowing her mother was watching with the concerned eyes of someone who had noticed her daughter's decreasing appetite. "You seem tired lately," Amira observed, settling into her own chair with a cup of strong Arabic coffee. Her dark hair was covered with a simple white hijab that seemed to glow against her olive skin, and her brown eyes, so similar to Zara's, held depths of maternal intuition that missed nothing. Zara shrugged, focusing intently on spreading labneh across her pita. "Just adjusting to the new school, Mama. It takes time." Khalil folded his newspaper with the precise movements that characterized everything he did. his attention now fully focused on his daughter. "Are your classmates treating you well? Are the teachers fair to you?" The questions hung in the air like incense, heavy with parental concern and the weight of unspoken fears. Zara knew her parents worried constantly about her adjustment to this new environment, having left behind the safety and familiarity of their old community for better job opportunities and what they hoped would be a brighter future for their only child. "Everyone is very nice," Zara said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. She had become an expert at crafting these small deceptions, building walls of false reassurance around her parents to protect them from the harsh reality of her daily existence. They had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities, working grueling hours and living in this smaller space, and she couldn't bear to add her problems to their already heavy burden. Khalil studied her face with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent years counseling troubled souls in his role as an imam. "Remember, Habibti, if anyone treats you poorly because of who you are or what you believe, it says nothing about you and everything about them. Your worth is not determined by the ignorance of others." His words carried the weight of experience and wisdom, but they felt hollow against the daily reality of whispered slurs and deliberate isolation. Zara nodded and smiled, the expression feeling like a mask stretched too tight across her face. "I know, Baba. Your teachings have given me strength." What she didn't tell him was how difficult it had become to hold on to those teachings when faced with relentless cruelty. Her philosophy of turning the other cheek and responding to hatred with kindness had shaped her entire worldview, but lately she found herself questioning whether such idealism could survive in the brutal ecosystem of high school social dynamics. The kitchen fell into comfortable silence as they finished breakfast, the only sounds being the gentle clink of silverware against plates and the distant hum of traffic outside their window. Zara found herself memorizing these peaceful moments, storing them away like precious jewels to sustain her through the long hours ahead. As she prepared to leave, Amira pressed a brown paper bag into her hands, warm from the kitchen's heat. "Fatouche salad for lunch," she explained with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And some of those date cookies you love." Zara accepted the bag with gratitude that felt disproportionate to the simple gesture. Her mother's food had become both comfort and burden. Comfort because it connected her to home and heritage. Burden because it marked her as different in a cafeteria full of processed foods and typical American lunches. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered, surprising herself by leaning over to kiss her mother's cheek. The gesture seemed to catch Amira off guard, and for a moment her composed expression cracked to reveal the worry that lived constantly beneath the surface. Khalil rose from his chair and placed his hands gently on Zara's shoulders, his touch conveying more protection and love than any words could express. "Walk with Allah's protection, Ya Nur Aini. Remember that you carry the strength of your ancestors and the prayers of your family with you, always." The blessing followed her out of the apartment and into the crisp October morning where autumn had painted the world in shades of amber and rust. The walk to Roosevelt High School took exactly 12 minutes, a journey she had timed obsessively during her first week, memorizing every crack in the sidewalk and every landmark that marked her progress toward daily torment. The school building loomed before her like a fortress of red brick and institutional conformity, its windows reflecting the morning sky like watchful eyes. Students streamed through the main entrance in clusters, their conversations creating a buzz of energy that seemed to exclude her by default. Zara pulled her worn leather messenger bag closer to her chest, the familiar weight of textbooks and notebooks providing a small measure of comfort. The hallway assault began the moment she stepped through the double doors. Roosevelt High's corridors were a maze of polished linoleum and metal lockers that seemed designed to amplify every sound and magnify every social interaction. The architecture itself felt hostile, with harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows and revealed every flaw with brutal clarity. Students moved through this space with the confidence of long-time residents, their voices creating a symphony of belonging that highlighted Zara's outsider status. She had studied the social geography of these halls with anthropological precision, mapping out the territories claimed by different cliques and identifying the safest routes to her classes. The whispers began almost immediately, following her like an invisible cloud of hostility that she could feel, even when she couldn't hear the exact words. Groups of students would lower their voices as she passed, their conversations dying momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. She had become a subject of fascination and revulsion, a living reminder of difference in a place that valued conformity above all else. Her first-period chemistry classroom offered only temporary sanctuary, and even that came at the cost of isolation. Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes, had established an atmosphere of rigid control that discouraged student interaction. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, and the walls were covered with periodic tables and safety posters that seemed to warn against more than just chemical hazards. Zara had claimed the seat in the back corner during her first day, as far from the center of attention as the room's geography would allow. From this vantage point, she could observe her classmates without directly engaging, studying their interactions like a scientist examining specimens. She had learned to read the subtle signals of teenage social dynamics, the way certain students commanded attention through charisma or fear, how alliances formed and dissolved based on unspoken hierarchies of popularity and power. The other students in her chemistry class had stopped trying to include her in their conversations after the first week, interpreting her quiet responses and careful distance as signs of unfriendliness rather than self-protection. She watched them partner up for lab experiments with the easy familiarity of people who had known each other for years, their shared history creating bonds that seemed impossible to penetrate. During these moments of observation, Zara found herself thinking about her uncle Rashid, who had shaped so much of her understanding about strength and survival. He had been her father's younger brother, a man whose path had diverged dramatically from Khalil's peaceful philosophy. Where her father had chosen the spiritual route of religious leadership, Rashid had embraced the physical world of combat and self-defense. Uncle Rashid had served in the Lebanese armed forces before immigrating to America, where he had used his military training to establish a successful self-defense academy in Detroit. His students had included everyone from housewives seeking confidence to law enforcement officers honing their skills. But Zara had been his most dedicated pupil, a small girl whose intensity and focus had impressed even his most experienced fighters. "Size means nothing if you understand leverage and timing," he had told her countless times during their training sessions in his sparse gym. A smaller fighter who thinks strategically will always defeat a larger opponent who relies only on strength. Those lessons had begun when Zara was 9 years old, initially as a way to build confidence and physical fitness. But as she demonstrated natural ability and genuine passion for the discipline, Rashid had begun teaching her more advanced techniques from Krav Maga, the Israeli martial art that emphasized practical self-defense and real-world application. Krav Maga is not about looking pretty or impressing judges, Rashid had explained during one memorable session, his scarred hands demonstrating a wrist-release technique with fluid precision. It's about surviving dangerous situations and protecting yourself and others. Every move has a purpose. Every technique has been tested in actual combat. For 8 years, Zara had absorbed these teachings like a sponge, her small frame disguising muscles trained to react with explosive speed and devastating accuracy. She had learned to see the human body as a complex machine with specific vulnerabilities, understanding how to disable larger opponents through precisely targeted strikes to pressure points, joints, and nerve centers. But perhaps most importantly, Rashid had taught her about the psychology of violence and the responsibility that came with deadly knowledge. "The most dangerous weapon you possess is your mind," he had said during their final training session before the families moved to Ohio. "These techniques I've taught you are tools for protection, not aggression. Use them only when all other options have been exhausted." The conflict between her uncle's teachings and her father's philosophy had become a source of internal tension that Zara struggled with daily. Khalil had never forbidden the training sessions, recognizing that his daughter needed physical activity and the confidence that came with it. But he had consistently emphasized that violence should always be a last resort, that true strength lay in forgiveness and understanding rather than retaliation. "Those who respond to hatred with hatred only perpetuate the cycle of suffering," he had told her after she had come home in tears following a particularly difficult day at her old school in Detroit. But those who respond to hatred with love and understanding can break that cycle and create something beautiful in its place. These competing philosophies warred within her as she sat through her morning classes, watching the clock creep toward lunch period with mounting dread. Each tick of the second hand brought her closer to the daily gauntlet of the cafeteria, where her differences became most apparent and her isolation most complete. The lunch bell rang with the harsh finality of a judge's gavel, sending students streaming toward the cafeteria with the enthusiasm of prisoners released from their cells. Zara packed her books slowly, delaying the inevitable as long as possible, but eventually the empty classroom forced her to join the migration toward the school's social epicenter. Roosevelt High's cafeteria was a vast space designed to accommodate hundreds of students simultaneously, its high ceiling and institutional lighting creating an atmosphere that felt more like a warehouse than a place for nourishment and relaxation. Long tables stretched across the room in perfect rows, their attached benches creating natural boundaries between different social groups. The serving line moved with military efficiency, offering an array of processed foods that bore little resemblance to the fresh homemade meals Zara was accustomed to eating. The smell of industrial cooking oil and preservatives made her stomach turn, reinforcing her dependence on the lunches her mother packed with such care and attention. She navigated through the chaos of teenage social dynamics, stepping carefully around conversations and avoiding eye contact that might be interpreted as challenges or invitations. The volume of noise in the cafeteria was overwhelming, with hundreds of voices competing to be heard above the clatter of trays and the scraping of chairs against linoleum floors. Her usual table sat in the far corner of the room, strategically positioned to provide maximum distance from the popular students who claimed the central territory like feudal lords surveying their domain. The table's location came at the cost of proximity to the kitchen, meaning she had to endure the constant traffic of cafeteria workers and the occasional waft of industrial disinfectant. But it offered something more valuable than comfort: invisibility. Zara settled into her customary seat and unpacked her lunch with ritualistic precision, arranging each item exactly as her mother had placed it in the bag. The fattoush salad looked vibrant and fresh against the drab backdrop of the cafeteria, its colors singing with the vitality of olive oil, lemon juice, and garden vegetables. The date cookies were wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a small piece of ribbon, a touch of elegance that seemed almost defiant in this environment of mass-produced mediocrity. She pulled out her worn copy of The Handmaid's Tale, a novel that had resonated with her on levels she was only beginning to understand. Margaret Atwood's dystopian vision of oppression and resistance spoke to something deep within her, offering both warning and inspiration. The protagonist struggled to maintain identity and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization, felt painfully relevant to her own daily existence. The book provided a shield against the cafeteria's social pressures, creating a bubble of literary refuge where she could lose herself in someone else's story and temporarily escape her own. She had become expert at appearing completely absorbed in her reading while maintaining peripheral awareness of potential threats, a survival skill that served her well in this hostile environment. But today, her concentration shattered like glass the moment Bradley Morrison's shadow fell across her table. She didn't need to look up to identify him. His presence carried a particular quality of menace that she had learned to recognize instinctively. The conversations at nearby tables died down as students sensed the potential for entertainment, their attention turning toward her corner like vultures circling carrion. Bradley Morrison stood 6 feet tall, with the kind of golden boy attractiveness that opened doors and smoothed paths through life's obstacles. His blonde hair was styled with expensive products that caught the fluorescent lights just right, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had never known real consequence for his actions. He wore his Letterman jacket like armor, the leather sleeves and varsity letters announcing his status as Roosevelt High's starting quarterback and undisputed alpha male. Behind him stood his ever-present lieutenants, Tyler Jenkins and Marcus Webb, completing the trinity of torment that had made Zara's life miserable since her arrival at Roosevelt High. Tyler's red hair and freckled face might have looked innocent if not for the cruel intelligence that lurked behind his green eyes. He was the group's strategist, the one who crafted their campaigns of psychological warfare with artistic precision. Marcus Webb provided the physical intimidation that made their threats credible. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his football jersey, he possessed the kind of imposing presence that made people step aside automatically. His dark hair was cropped short in a military style that emphasized the sharp angles of his face and the perpetual scowl that seemed carved from stone. Together, they formed a triumvirate of teenage cruelty that had perfected the art of psychological torment without crossing lines that would attract official attention. They were too smart to leave obvious evidence, too popular to face serious consequences, and too skilled at reading their victims to choose targets who might effectively fight back. "What's for lunch, bomber?" Bradley's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade, loud enough to ensure that surrounding tables could hear every word. The nickname had been his creation, a verbal weapon designed to reduce her complex identity to a single hateful stereotype. Zara forced herself to look up from her book, meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. She had learned that avoiding eye contact only encouraged escalation, while staring too boldly could be interpreted as challenge or defiance. The balance was delicate, requiring constant calibration based on mood and circumstances. "It's Lebanese salad," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough strength to avoid sounding weak while remaining respectful enough to avoid provocation. "Would you like to try some?" The offer had emerged spontaneously, born from some deep well of grace that surprised even her. For a moment, Bradley's practiced expression flickered with confusion, as if he hadn't expected such a response. The nearby students leaned forward slightly, sensing that the familiar script had been disrupted. Tyler recovered first, his laugh sharp and mocking. "Oh, she's sharing now. How generous of our little terrorist to offer us some of her bomb-making ingredients." The joke earned scattered laughter from their audience, but Zara noticed that some students looked uncomfortable with the exchange. She filed away these observations, mentally cataloguing potential allies and definite enemies with the systematic approach her uncle had taught her for assessing threats in unfamiliar environments. Marcus stepped closer, his massive frame casting an even larger shadow across her table. What's in it anyway? Probably some weird foreign stuff that normal people wouldn't eat. The casual dehumanization in his tone struck her like a physical blow. These boys had perfected the art of othering, reducing her to a collection of stereotypes and prejudices that made it easier to justify their cruelty. She wasn't a person with feelings, dreams, and fears. She was simply a target, a representative of everything they had been taught to fear and hate. "Just vegetables and herbs," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around her book until the pages crinkled under the pressure. "Lettuce, tomatoes, cucumber, parsley, mint. The dressing is olive oil and lemon juice." Bradley leaned forward, his cologne overwhelming her senses as he invaded her personal space with predatory confidence. The scent was expensive and cloying, probably applied in the locker room to mask the smell of sweat and teenage anxiety that he would never admit to feeling. "Sounds disgusting," he said with theatrical revulsion. "No wonder you people blow things up. You're already poisoning yourselves with that foreign garbage." The comment drew more laughter from their growing audience, students attracted by the promise of drama and the safety of group participation in cruelty. Zara recognized some faces from her classes, people who had seemed friendly or at least neutral in other contexts, but who now wore expressions of entertainment or indifference. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her of lessons about forgiveness and understanding. When someone attacks you with words, Habibti, they are really attacking their own fears and insecurities. Respond with compassion, and you may help them heal the wounds that drive their anger. But sitting in that cafeteria, surrounded by the laughter of people who saw her suffering as entertainment, compassion felt like an impossible luxury. The weight of daily humiliation had accumulated like scar tissue, making each new wound more painful than the last. "I understand if you're not interested," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not everyone appreciates different types of food." Tyler's grin widened at her diplomatic response, recognizing it as weakness rather than strength. "Oh, we appreciate it all right. We appreciate how weird and disgusting it is, just like everything else about you." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud, spreading its poison through the surrounding tables. Zara felt her cheeks burn with shame, not for her food or her culture, but for being trapped in this public humiliation with no graceful way to escape. Bradley reached out suddenly, his manicured fingers closing around her plastic container with casual ownership. "You know what? I think we should see just how disgusting this terrorist food really is." Time seemed to slow as he lifted the container above his head, his smile wide with malicious glee. Zara watched in horror as he turned it over, sending her carefully prepared lunch cascading across the table in a shower of vegetables, herbs, and dressing. The sound of the impact seemed impossibly loud, like breaking glass in a cathedral. Lettuce leaves scattered across the surface like green confetti, while tomato pieces rolled toward the edges in small, sad trajectories. The olive oil and lemon dressing spread in abstract patterns, soaking into napkins and creating slick pools that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. The smell of mint and parsley rose from the mess, familiar and comforting scents that now felt like evidence of her otherness. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and nervous laughter, the sound washing over her like a tide of cruelty. Students pulled out phones to capture the moment, ensuring that her humiliation would be preserved and shared across social media platforms, extending her shame far beyond the physical boundaries of Roosevelt High School. Zara stared at the wreckage of her lunch, seeing more than just spilled food. She saw her mother's love and care scattered like debris, her family's heritage treated as garbage, her own dignity trampled underfoot, the careful preparation that had gone into each ingredient, the time her mother had spent cutting vegetables into perfect crescents and mixing the dressing just right. All of it reduced to waste and mockery. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, 8 years of combat training, sending adrenaline surging through her system like liquid fire. Every muscle in her body screamed for action, for retaliation, for the satisfaction of watching Bradley Morrison crumple under the precise application of the techniques her uncle had drilled into her until they became instinctive. She could visualize the sequence of movements with crystalline clarity, a strike to his solar plexus to double him over, followed by a knee to his face and an elbow to the back of his neck. 3 seconds, 4 moves, and he would be unconscious on the cafeteria floor while she stood over him unharmed. Tyler and Marcus would be next, their size and strength meaningless against her speed and precision. But her father's voice cut through the fantasy like a sword of conscience. Violence only creates more violence, Habibti. Break the cycle with compassion and understanding. Show them the beauty of our faith through your actions, not your fists. The internal conflict raged for several heartbeats, training and philosophy warring within her, while Bradley's laughter echoed through the cafeteria like the sound of breaking dreams. Finally, with tremendous effort, she unclenched her fists and reached for the napkins in her bag. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the continuing laughter and conversation. But those nearby heard her, and something in her tone made the laughter falter slightly. Bradley's smile widened at her restrained response, interpreting it as complete victory. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings? Maybe you should call your daddy to come pick you up and take you back to whatever desert you crawled out of." The racial slur hit her like a physical blow, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the cafeteria noise with sharp authority. "Leave her alone, Bradley." Emma Sullivan emerged from the crowd like an avenging angel, her auburn hair catching the lights as she moved with purposeful strides toward their table. Emma was one of the few students at Roosevelt High who had shown Zara any kindness, offering smiles in the hallways and occasional comments about shared reading assignments in their English literature class. At 16, Emma possessed the kind of natural beauty that didn't require cosmetics or artificial enhancement. Clear skin that flushed easily with emotion, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and compassion, and a smile that could light up even the darkest corners of Roosevelt High's oppressive atmosphere. But more importantly, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never learned to be afraid of standing up for what was right. "Well, well," Tyler said, his freckled face lighting up with malicious delight. "If it isn't Saint Emma coming to save the day, I didn't know you had a thing for terrorists." Emma's green eyes flashed with anger as she reached Zara's table, her presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation. Several students began filming with their phones, sensing that the drama was about to escalate to new levels of entertainment. "I said leave her alone," Emma repeated, placing a protective hand on Zara's shoulder. The gesture sent warmth spreading through Zara's chest, the first genuine human contact she had experienced at school in weeks. "She hasn't done anything to you." Bradley's attention shifted to Emma with predatory interest, his smile taking on a different quality as he processed this new development. Emma was popular enough to make her support significant, attractive enough to make her attention valuable, and bold enough to make her defiance intriguing. "You know, Emma," he said, his voice taking on a seductive quality that made Zara's skin crawl, "I never took you for someone who sympathizes with America's enemies. Maybe you need to reconsider the company you keep?" Emma's jaw tightened at the implication, but she refused to back down. "The only enemy I see here is ignorance, and maybe you should reconsider being such a complete jackass." The insult drew gasps from their audience, students recognizing that Emma had just crossed a line that could have serious social consequences. Bradley's expression darkened, his handsome features twisting with rage at being publicly challenged by someone he had considered beneath his attention. "You've got quite a mouth on you," he said, stepping closer to Emma with obvious menace. "Maybe someone should teach you some manners." Before Zara could react to the threat, Marcus moved with surprising speed for someone his size, reaching out to grab Emma's arm with his massive hand. His fingers wrapped around her wrist like a vice, and Zara could see Emma wince at the pressure despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Yeah," Marcus growled, his deep voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Maybe we should educate both of you ladies about respect." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Zara felt something fundamental shift within her chest. All thoughts of her father's teachings, all considerations of peaceful resolution, all concerns about consequences evaporated in the face of seeing Emma, kind, brave Emma who had risked herself to defend her, being threatened with violence. The cafeteria had fallen completely silent now, hundreds of students watching the confrontation with the morbid fascination of spectators at a gladiator match. Some were still recording with their phones, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved and distributed across the internet within minutes. Zara rose slowly from her seat, her movements fluid and controlled in a way that would have made her uncle proud. 8 years of training had taught her to recognize the moment when violence became inevitable, when all diplomatic options had been exhausted and action became necessary for survival and protection. "Let her go," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with unexpected authority. Something in her tone made Marcus loosen his grip slightly, confusion flickering across his features. Tyler laughed nervously, sensing that the familiar dynamics were shifting in ways he couldn't predict or control. "Oh, look who's finally growing a backbone. What are you going to do, pray us to death?" But Bradley was studying Zara's posture with more attention, his athletic instincts recognizing something different in the way she held herself. Where before she had slouched with the defeated posture of chronic victimization, she now stood with the balanced stance of someone prepared for action. "I asked you to let her go," Zara repeated, taking a step closer to Marcus. Her dark eyes had taken on a quality that made several nearby students unconsciously step backward, though they couldn't have explained why. Marcus tightened his grip on Emma's wrist, his pride demanding that he maintain dominance in front of their audience. "Or what, terrorist? You'll blow us all up?" The racial slur seemed to echo through the cafeteria, and Zara felt the last threads of restraint snap like over-tightened cables. Her father's philosophy had served its purpose, teaching her patience and compassion that would make her a better person in the long run. But there were moments when philosophy had to yield to necessity, when turning the other cheek meant allowing innocent people to suffer. "Or I'll make you let her go," she said simply, her voice carrying a promise that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Bradley stepped forward, his quarterback instincts finally recognizing a challenge that required his personal attention. "You think you're tough now? Let's see how tough you are when you're eating through a straw for the next month." He swung at her with the confident aggression of someone who had never faced real resistance, his fist cutting through the air in a wide, telegraphed arc that screamed amateur to anyone with genuine fighting experience. Zara watched the punch approach with the detached calm of someone who had spent thousands of hours training for exactly this moment. Time seemed to slow as 8 years of muscle memory took control of her body. Every lesson her uncle had taught her flooding back with crystalline clarity. She stepped slightly to her left, letting Bradley's fist sail harmlessly past her head, while her right hand shot forward in a precise strike to his solar plexus. The technique was called a straight punch in Krav Maga terminology, but that clinical description failed to capture the devastating effectiveness of the movement. Her knuckles connected with the soft tissue just below Bradley's sternum, driving the air from his lungs and sending shock waves through his nervous system. Bradley's eyes widened in shock and pain as he doubled over, clutching his chest and gasping for breath that wouldn't come. The confident swagger that had defined his every interaction dissolved in seconds, replaced by the vulnerability of someone experiencing their first taste of real violence. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and screams, students pressing backward to create space around the confrontation while simultaneously straining to get better views for their phone recordings. The sound was deafening, a mixture of shock, excitement, and fear that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Tyler stared at his fallen leader with disbelief, his strategic mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The girl they had tormented for months, the quiet victim who had absorbed their abuse without retaliation, had just dropped the school's star athlete with a single punch. "Holy shit!" someone whispered from the crowd, their voice carrying clearly in the momentary lull. "Did you see that?" Marcus released Emma's wrist and lunged towards Zara with a roar of rage, his massive frame bearing down on her like an avalanche. But Zara had trained extensively against larger opponents, learning to use their size and momentum against them through precise application of leverage and timing. She dropped low as Marcus reached her, sweeping her leg behind his ankles while simultaneously pushing against his chest with her palms. The technique was called a foot sweep, and it used his own forward momentum to send him crashing to the linoleum floor with bone-jarring force. The impact shook the entire cafeteria, and Marcus lay stunned for several seconds before struggling to push himself up on his elbows. His face was flushed with embarrassment and rage, unable to comprehend how someone a third his size had put him on his back so easily. Tyler backed away from Zara with newfound respect and fear, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that came too late to prevent his involvement in the confrontation. Wait, he stammered, his voice cracking with anxiety. "We don't want any trouble." But Zara was beyond listening to pleas for mercy. 3 months of accumulated rage and humiliation had found their outlet, and the euphoria of finally fighting back was intoxicating. She advanced on Tyler with fluid grace, every movement economical and purposeful. Tyler threw a wild punch that telegraphed itself from miles away, and Zara deflected it with a technique called a parry before driving her knee into his stomach. He folded around the impact with a whoosh of expelled air, and her follow-up elbow strike to his back sent him sprawling beside his friends. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the reversal was so complete and unexpected that it seemed to rewrite the fundamental laws of Roosevelt High's social universe. The 3 most feared bullies in school lay groaning on the cafeteria floor while their former victims stood over them, breathing slightly hard but otherwise unharmed. The silence that followed was absolute, hundreds of students processing what they had witnessed with expressions of shock, awe, and fear. Phone cameras captured every angle of the aftermath, ensuring that this moment would become legend within hours and spread far beyond the school's boundaries. Emma stared at Zara with wide green eyes, her hand rubbing the wrist where Marcus had grabbed her. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" she whispered, her voice filled with amazement and gratitude. Zara's expression softened as she looked at the girl who had risked herself to defend her, the adrenaline beginning to fade and leave room for other emotions. "My uncle taught me," she said simply. "I never wanted to use it, but they left me no choice." Bradley struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and humiliation. His perfect hair was disheveled, his Letterman jacket torn at the shoulder, and his blue eyes burned with hatred that promised retribution. The crowd around him seemed to shrink back, no longer viewing him as the untouchable golden boy who could do no wrong. "This isn't over," he gasped, still clutching his chest where her punch had landed. "You'll pay for this, you little bitch." Zara stepped forward, her movement causing Bradley to flinch backward instinctively. The shift in power dynamics was so complete that even he could feel it, the prey becoming predator in the span of a heartbeat. "Yes, it is over," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent cafeteria. "You've bullied me for months, and I let you because I believed in solving problems peacefully. But when you touched Emma, when you threatened someone who was trying to help me, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." She looked around at the gathered crowd, her gaze taking in every face that had watched her humiliation over the past 3 months. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I won't be anyone's victim anymore. If you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. But if you come after me or my friends again, what happened today will seem like a gentle warning." The promise hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, and Zara could see its impact in the eyes of every student present. She had transformed from invisible victim to genuine threat in the space of 30 seconds, and everyone who had witnessed it understood that the social order of Roosevelt High School had just undergone a fundamental shift. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly lunch monitor, finally pushed through the crowd with the assistance of 2 custodians, her grey hair disheveled and her face flushed with exertion. She stared at the 3 boys on the floor and then at Zara, clearly struggling to reconcile the scene before her with everything she thought she knew about the quiet girl who always sat alone. "What happened here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been dealing with teenage drama for decades. Bradley straightened his jacket and arranged his features into an expression of injured innocence, the transformation so smooth it was clearly well practiced. "Mrs. Henderson, she attacked us for no reason. We were just trying to be friendly and she went crazy." The lie was so brazen that several students gasped audibly, but Zara wasn't surprised by the attempt to rewrite history. She had learned that people like Bradley viewed the truth as a flexible commodity, to be shaped and molded according to their needs and desires. "That's not what happened," Emma said firmly, stepping closer to Zara in a gesture of solidarity. "They were bullying her. They destroyed her lunch, and Marcus grabbed me when I tried to help. She was defending both of us." Tyler wiped blood from his lip and glared at Emma with venomous hatred. "She's lying, Mrs. Henderson. That terrorist psycho just snapped and started attacking everyone." The racial slur drew angry murmurs from some members of the crowd, students who had remained silent during the bullying, but found their voices now that the power dynamics had shifted. Mrs. Henderson looked around at the sea of faces, clearly trying to determine which version of events to believe. "I have witnesses who saw everything," she said finally. "I'll be interviewing students and reviewing security footage. Everyone involved will be in the principal's office immediately." As the crowd began to disperse, students buzzed with excitement and speculation about what they had witnessed. Many approached Zara with newfound respect, offering words of support and admiration for her courage. Others seemed afraid of her, giving her wide berths as they passed and whispering nervously about her fighting skills. The walk to Principal Morrison's office, no relation to Bradley, despite the shared surname, felt like a march through a transformed landscape. Students who had ignored her for months now watched her pass with obvious interest, their expressions ranging from admiration to fear to curiosity. Emma walked beside her, providing moral support through her presence and occasional reassuring touches on her arm. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly as they approached the administrative offices. Zara considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her physical and emotional state. "I think so," she said finally. "I'm scared about what happens next, but I'm also relieved that it's finally over." The principal's office was a sterile space designed to intimidate students through its stark formality. Principal Morrison sat behind his massive oak desk like a judge preparing to render verdict, his silver hair and stern expression lending gravity to the proceedings. He was a man in his late 50s who had spent his entire career in education, working his way up from teacher to administrator through decades of dealing with teenage drama and parental politics. Bradley, Tyler, and Marcus sat in chairs across from the principal's desk, their injuries visible but not serious enough to require medical attention. They had clearly used the walk to the office to coordinate their stories, and their expressions suggested confidence in their ability to manipulate the situation to their advantage. Mrs. Henderson stood near the window, her notebook filled with preliminary statements from witnesses. Her expression was troubled, suggesting that the testimony she had gathered didn't align with the boys' version of events. "Miss Okafor," Principal Morrison said as Zara entered with Emma, "please have a seat. We need to discuss what happened in the cafeteria today." Zara settled into the designated chair, her posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. 8 years of martial arts training had taught her the importance of mental discipline along with physical technique, and she drew on that training now to maintain composure in the face of potential consequences. "Before we begin," Principal Morrison continued, "I want to make it clear that Roosevelt High School has a zero-tolerance policy regarding violence. Fighting on school grounds is grounds for immediate suspension, regardless of the circumstances." The statement felt like a sword hanging over her head, but Zara had expected as much. She had known when she chose to fight back that there would be consequences, and she was prepared to accept them rather than return to her previous state of helpless victimization. "Now then," the principal said, opening a file folder on his desk, "I've received conflicting accounts of what transpired. Mr. Morrison, would you like to tell me your version of events?" Bradley leaned forward in his chair, his blue eyes wide with practiced sincerity. "Principal Morrison, we were just trying to be friendly with Zara. You know how hard it can be for new students to fit in, so we went over to her table to include her in our conversation." The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that Zara almost admired the skill involved. Bradley had clearly perfected the art of manipulation through years of practice, learning to present himself as the victim even when he was clearly the aggressor. "We were just talking," Tyler added, touching his swollen lip gingerly. "Maybe joking around a little bit, but nothing mean. Then suddenly she just exploded and started attacking us for no reason." Marcus nodded emphatically, his massive frame somehow managing to look vulnerable despite his size. "She hit Bradley first, and when we tried to help him, she attacked us too. It was like she went crazy or something." Principal Morrison made notes in his file, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts on their testimony. "And Miss Sullivan, you were involved? How?" Emma's green eyes flashed with anger at the boys' version of events. "That's completely false," she said firmly. "They were bullying Zara, calling her names and making racist comments. Bradley destroyed her lunch deliberately, and when I tried to defend her, Marcus grabbed my wrist and threatened both of us." "She's lying," Tyler said quickly. "She wasn't even there when it started. She just showed up and started making accusations." The back and forth continued for several minutes, with each side presenting contradictory accounts of the confrontation. Principal Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but revealing nothing about his own assessment of the situation. Finally, he turned to Zara, who had remained silent throughout the preceding testimony. "Miss Okafor, I'd like to hear your version of what happened." Zara took a deep breath, drawing on her father's teachings about honesty and integrity, even in difficult circumstances. "They were bullying me," she said simply. "They've been doing it since I started school here 3 months ago. Today, they destroyed my lunch and called me names. And when Emma tried to help me, Marcus grabbed her and threatened us both." "But why did you resort to violence?" Principal Morrison asked. "Why didn't you come to the administration for help?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. and Zara felt the weight of adult expectations pressing down on her. How could she explain that she had tried to handle the situation peacefully for months, that she had absorbed daily humiliation in hopes that it would eventually stop, that the adults in charge had either ignored the problem or failed to recognize its severity? "I tried to ignore them," she said finally. "My father taught me that responding to hatred with violence only creates more hatred. But when they threatened Emma, when they put their hands on someone who was trying to help me, I couldn't just stand by and watch." Principal Morrison made more notes, his pen scratching across the paper with deliberate precision. "Mrs. Henderson, what did the witnesses tell you?" The elderly woman consulted her notebook, her expression grave. "The accounts vary depending on who's telling the story, but several students confirmed that there was ongoing harassment. Multiple witnesses saw the boys destroy Miss Okafor's lunch and heard derogatory comments about her religion and ethnicity." Bradley's confident expression flickered slightly at this revelation, but he quickly recovered. "Those are just rumors," he said. "You know how students like to exaggerate things." "Several students also reported that Marcus grabbed Miss Sullivan's wrist when she tried to intervene," Mrs. Henderson continued, "and there were multiple recordings of the incident that might provide additional context." The mention of video evidence seemed to drain some of the color from the boys' faces, particularly Tyler, who had been most confident about their ability to control the narrative. In the age of smartphones and social media, few events at Roosevelt High School went unrecorded. Principal Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying each student with the analytical gaze of someone who had seen every variation of teenage drama imaginable. "I'm going to review the security footage and examine any student recordings that are brought to my attention. I'll also be conducting additional interviews with witnesses." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation settle over everyone present. "However, regardless of who started the confrontation, Miss Okafor, you engaged in physical violence on school property. That requires consequences." Zara nodded, having expected this outcome from the moment she chose to fight back. "I understand," she said quietly. "I accept responsibility for my actions." The admission seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Principal Morrison, who was more accustomed to students denying responsibility and making excuses. Her quiet dignity in the face of consequences seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. "Given the circumstances," he continued after a moment, "and pending further investigation into the harassment allegations, I'm suspending all parties involved for 3 days. Miss Okafor and Miss Sullivan will serve in-school suspension, while Mr. Morrison, Mr. Jenkins, and Mr. Webb will serve traditional suspension." The decision drew gasps of outrage from the 3 boys, who clearly had expected their social status and athletic importance to shield them from serious consequences. Bradley's face flushed red with anger as he realized that his version of events hadn't been automatically accepted. "That's not fair," Tyler protested. "She attacked us. Why are we getting suspended when we're the victims?" Principal Morrison's expression hardened at the challenge to his authority. "Mr. Jenkins, your behavior over the past several months has not gone unnoticed. This incident appears to be the culmination of ongoing harassment that the administration has failed to address adequately." He turned to address all 3 boys with stern disapproval. "Furthermore, if the investigation reveals that you've been engaging in systematic bullying based on Miss Okafor's religion or ethnicity, you'll face additional disciplinary action up to and including expulsion." The threat seemed to deflate their remaining bravado, and they left the office in sullen silence. Emma squeezed Zara's hand as they prepared to leave, her touch conveying gratitude and solidarity that meant more than any words could express. As they walked toward their in-school suspension classroom, Emma broke the silence that had settled between them. "I'm sorry you had to go through all of that," she said, "but I'm also proud of you for finally standing up for yourself." Zara considered her friend's words as they navigated the empty hallways, the school feeling different somehow in the aftermath of her transformation. "My father is going to be disappointed," she said finally. "He believes that violence is never the answer." Emma stopped walking and turned to face her, green eyes serious with conviction. "Sometimes violence is the only language bullies understand. You gave them every chance to leave you alone, and they chose to escalate instead." The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normal routine, spent in a small classroom with other suspended students under the watchful eye of Mrs. Rodriguez, a Spanish teacher who volunteered for supervision duty. The room was stark and institutional, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows and desks arranged in perfect rows that discouraged interaction. Zara used the time for reflection and study, working through assignments that her teachers had provided while processing the dramatic changes in her life. The isolation was actually welcome after months of navigating the social minefield of Roosevelt High School, providing space to think without the constant pressure of potential harassment. Emma served her suspension in the same room, and they were able to communicate through carefully passed notes and meaningful glances. Their shared experience had deepened their friendship in ways that normal circumstances might never have achieved, bonding them through adversity and mutual support. On the second day, Mrs. Rodriguez approached Zara's desk with a thoughtful expression, her kind eyes holding the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about her students' well-being. "I heard about what happened in the cafeteria," she said quietly. "How are you holding up?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Zara felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes. "I'm okay," she said, her voice slightly hoarse from disuse. "Just thinking about everything." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "I know this situation has been difficult for you. I want you to know that many of us on the faculty have been aware of the harassment you faced, and we're sorry we didn't intervene sooner." The admission was both validating and frustrating. Validating because it confirmed that her suffering had been real and visible. Frustrating because it meant that adults who could have helped had chosen to look away instead. "Why didn't anyone do anything?" Zara asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. Mrs. Rodriguez sighed deeply, her expression revealing the weight of institutional failure and personal regret. "Because we failed you," she said simply. "We told ourselves that boys will be boys, that you were strong enough to handle it, that intervention might make things worse. But mostly, we failed because it was easier to ignore the problem than to confront it." The honesty was refreshing after so many months of adult indifference and willful blindness. "What changes now?" Zara asked. "Everything," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "The administration is implementing new anti-bullying protocols. Teachers are receiving sensitivity training, and there's going to be zero tolerance for the kind of behavior you experienced." When Zara returned to Roosevelt High School after her suspension, she found a dramatically transformed social landscape waiting for her. The hallways that had once felt like gauntlets of hostility now seemed to part before her with something approaching respect, students stepping aside and offering nervous smiles as she passed. The change was most apparent in the cafeteria, where she was no longer forced to sit alone in her corner table. Several students approached her during the first lunch period, some to offer friendship, others to share their own stories of being bullied, and a few to ask if she might be willing to teach them some of the self-defense techniques she had demonstrated. "I never knew you could fight like that," said Jessica Martinez, a sophomore who had been targeted by older students for her weight. "Could you maybe show me some moves? I'm tired of being pushed around." The request was followed by similar inquiries from other students, and Zara found herself at the center of an informal support network that grew larger each day. Emma had been instrumental in organizing this group, using her social connections to create a safe space for students who had previously suffered in silence. "We could meet after school," Emma suggested during one lunch conversation. "Maybe in the old wrestling room that doesn't get used anymore." Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd supervise if we asked. The idea of teaching self-defense to other students appealed to Zara on multiple levels. It would allow her to share her uncle's teachings with people who needed them, create a support system for victims of bullying, and perhaps most importantly, channel her own experiences into something positive and constructive. "I'd like that," she said, feeling a spark of enthusiasm that had been absent for months. "My uncle always said that the best way to honor your training is to pass it on to others who need it." The self-defense group became a reality within 2 weeks, growing from 5 founding members to over 20 students of various ages, backgrounds, and experience levels. They met 3 times a week in the old wrestling room, working on basic techniques while discussing strategies for avoiding and diffusing confrontational situations. Zara discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching, able to break down complex movements into understandable components, while emphasizing the mental discipline that her uncle had considered equally important as physical skill. "Remember," she would tell her students, echoing Rashid's words, "these techniques are tools for protection, not aggression. Use them only when all other options have been exhausted." The group's existence sent ripples through Roosevelt High School's social ecosystem, creating a visible reminder that victims of bullying no longer had to suffer alone or without recourse. The psychological impact was as significant as any physical deterrent, shifting power dynamics in ways that extended far beyond the wrestling room's walls. Bradley Morrison returned from his suspension a changed person, his former confidence replaced by wariness and subdued anger that he was careful to keep hidden from adult observation. His arm had healed completely, but the psychological wounds of public humiliation seemed to run much deeper. He avoided Zara entirely, changing his route through the hallways when necessary to prevent any chance encounters. Tyler and Marcus showed similar patterns of avoidance, their former swagger replaced by nervous glances and careful attention to their surroundings. The video recordings of their defeat had spread through social media with viral intensity, earning them ridicule from students at other schools and destroying their carefully cultivated reputations as untouchable bullies. The transformation wasn't limited to her former tormentors. Teachers who had previously overlooked or minimized harassment now responded quickly to complaints. Administrators implemented new policies with genuine commitment to enforcement, and students who had once been bystanders began speaking up when they witnessed bullying. Mrs. Patterson, her chemistry teacher, approached Zara after class one afternoon with an expression of profound regret. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew what was happening and I chose to look away because it was easier than getting involved. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." The apology was accepted gracefully, but it served as a reminder of how many adults had failed her during those difficult months. The knowledge was painful, but also liberating, helping her understand that their inaction had reflected their own limitations rather than any deficiency on her part. As winter settled over Roosevelt High School, Zara's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The girl who had once tried to make herself invisible now walked the halls with quiet confidence, her bright yellow hijab no longer a target for harassment, but a symbol of courage and resilience. Her relationship with Emma had deepened into something beyond friendship, though neither of them had explicitly acknowledged the shift. They spent increasing amounts of time together, studying in the library, sharing meals, and talking late into the evening about everything from literature to philosophy to their dreams for the future. "I've been thinking about what you said," Emma mentioned one afternoon as they walked home from school together, the December air crisp with the promise of snow. about your uncle's teachings and the responsibility that comes with knowing how to fight. Zara adjusted her scarf against the cold wind, curious about where the conversation was leading. What about it? Emma's cheeks were flushed with more than just cold air, and she seemed to be gathering courage for something difficult. I think what you did that day in the cafeteria was brave, but more than that, it was necessary. Someone needed to stand up to them, and you were the only one strong enough to do it. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Zara felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared values and mutual respect that transcended ordinary friendship. "I'm glad you were there," Zara said softly. "I don't think I could have found the courage to fight back if you hadn't been willing to defend me first." Emma stopped walking and turned to face her, green eyes bright with emotion. "I would defend you against anything," she said simply, the declaration carrying the weight of absolute truth. They stood there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the quiet beauty of suburban winter, while something unnamed but powerful passed between them. The moment stretched until Emma finally broke the silence with a shy smile. "So," she said, her tone deliberately lighter, "are you ready for your mom's cooking tonight? She invited me for dinner, and I'm excited to try authentic Lebanese food." The change of subject was welcome, allowing them to step back from emotional intensity while preserving the connection they had just acknowledged. Zara's parents had embraced Emma with the warmth they reserved for family, recognizing her importance in their daughter's life and treating her accordingly. Dinner at the Okafor household had become a weekly tradition, with Amira preparing elaborate spreads of traditional dishes, while Khalil engaged Emma in discussions about literature, philosophy, and current events. Emma's genuine interest in their culture and her respectful questions about Islam had won over both parents completely. "She's a good friend," Khalil had observed to his daughter after Emma's first visit. "She sees you for who you truly are, not what others might project onto you." The insight had struck Zara as particularly profound, highlighting something essential about their relationship that she had felt but hadn't articulated. Emma's friendship had never felt conditional or performative. It was simply authentic connection between two people who recognized something valuable in each other. As they approached her family's apartment building, Zara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had entered Roosevelt High School as a frightened victim had emerged as a confident young woman surrounded by genuine friends and filled with purpose. The transformation hadn't been without cost. She still struggled with the contradiction between her father's pacifist teachings and her own willingness to use violence when necessary. But she had learned that life rarely offered perfect choices, that sometimes the only way to create peace was to first establish boundaries through strength. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked as they climbed the stairs to Zara's floor. "Fighting back that day, I mean." Zara considered the question as she searched for her keys, thinking about all the changes that had flowed from that moment of decision in the cafeteria. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret defending myself and protecting you." Emma's smile in response was radiant, full of warmth and understanding that made Zara's chest tighten with emotions she was still learning to name. Whatever lay ahead for them, she knew that her life had been fundamentally changed by the courage to stand up for herself and the friendship of someone willing to stand beside her. The apartment smelled of cardamom and cinnamon when they opened the door, familiar scents that spoke of home and belonging in ways that transcended geography. Amira emerged from the kitchen with flour dusting her hands and a smile that could have powered the entire building. "Emma, Habibti!" she exclaimed, embracing her daughter's friend with genuine affection. "I've been cooking all afternoon. I hope you're hungry." As they settled around the dinner table, surrounded by the warmth of family and friendship, Zara reflected on how much her definition of strength had evolved. She had learned that true courage wasn't about avoiding conflict or accepting injustice. It was about standing up for what was right, protecting those who needed protection, and building connections that could withstand any external pressure. The bright yellow hijab that had once made her a target now felt like a crown, a symbol of heritage and identity that she wore with pride rather than fear. The girl who had once tried to become invisible had discovered that true power came from being fully, authentically herself in a world that often demanded conformity. And as Emma laughed at something her father had said, as her mother bustled around serving food with loving attention to every detail, as the warmth of belonging settled around her like a protective embrace, Zara understood that she had found something more valuable than acceptance or popularity or the absence of conflict. She had found herself, and that was worth fighting for.